Hello, and welcome to Chasing Leviathan, the podcast where we pursue big questions. My goal today is to listen and learn just a little bit more. As we head into our conversation, let me invite you to chase life's biggest questions with me, one episode at a time. Tell me a little bit about your journey to becoming a professor in the humanities, and how did you come to write this book? I saw a little bit in the acknowledgments, and that story sounded fun. But if you give people an idea of your professional journey and then of your journey in writing this book, Defense of Judgment.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Those on YouTube.
Yeah, so it's my journey to be a professor. I always loved literature. I always loved writing, and then I also really learned that I hated and was not good at 9-to-5 jobs. After I got out of college, I was fired from a number of jobs and ended up repossessing riding mowers before I was fired from that job. And so then I applied to graduate school as an effort to find a more congenial space. And I write creatively as well. And I've written a couple literary memoirs. One was about my experience of heroin addiction when I was in graduate school. And the other one is about about video games. But then I also do literary, sort of academic literary criticism. And I've always loved doing that and believed in it. And then what led me to this project in particular were a couple of moments that happened around 2015, partly due to teaching. And one of them was just this really interesting moment in a class I was teaching. My students are great. And we were teaching Sylvia Plath. And a bunch of the students in the class, for whatever reason, just did not like Sylvia Plath. They did not like the poetry. And they asked, why do we have to read this, right? You know what I mean? Like, you say it's really good, but here we are reading it and we're not feeling it. We don't like it. We don't like it. Why do we have to read it? And I thought that was a really good question, and a really deep question, which was, what is the basis of the authority by which a literature professor such as myself assigns a work to students? And why should they trust me? What's involved in the whole question of literary judgment, right? And why this became an interest, in a way, why this became a hard question for me to answer at that moment, where I don't think it would have been 30 or 40 years before, is because academia, reflecting broader social trends, has become embarrassed about doing anything that looks elitist, right? And so professors were sort of, kind of really not talking about judgment, not talking about what we do as exposing students to great literature, as showing them how to appreciate important and great literature. And the other thing that happened was I had a friend named Erin Kunyan who wrote an article about this poet who had attracted controversy because of what people took to be her heterodox political beliefs. And Erin pointed out, the problem with this poetry is not that its opinions are bad, but that the poetry sucks, right? That the poetry is not good. And there was a huge backlash to that. The whole idea that you would be making aesthetic judgments as opposed to political judgments was anathema to large swaths of the writing world, the literary world, the academic world. So these two incidents put together this interesting question that my students posed to me, finding I didn't have a great answer to that. And then this strange reaction that my friend's essay got led me to think, hey, this is an interesting topic and what might be an important topic. And let me just spend some real time digging into the question of why has our culture become so resistant to the idea of aesthetic judgment, of judging that some literary works or artworks are more worth your time than others, and what underlies the authority that literature or art professors have in saying to students, which we do, these works on the syllabus are going to be important enough for you to spend time with, even though you may not like them at first.
Who would you say is your intended audience for this book? Because I could see it functioning in different contexts, and maybe you have multiple audiences in mind. But so I'm curious if you had a primary audience or if you see this functioning in multiple contexts.
This book is I write for different audiences. Sometimes when I write for publications like The Atlantic or Harper's or places like that, or my creative works, I'm going for a very a larger general audience of people who are curious and interested. And it presumes some level of sort of education or familiarity, but not hyper specialized. With this book, I was really trying to reach literature professors, graduate students, and undergraduate students. I was really speaking to the world of academia with this project, which and I think it has it's of interest. I think more broadly because I think it's a cultural issue. But the people I wanted to really reach were educators, people who are in the position of writing syllabi, of teaching literature, and asking us to think about what is it that we're really doing here? What's the big question? It's real simple. When I or any of us, any of the tens of thousands of literature professors or high school teachers, whoever, are teaching literature, when we make a syllabus and tell students to read it, what are we doing? You know what I mean? Like
Right.
what value do we expect the student to get from it? What authority do we have to recommend that? So that's kind of the audience I was thinking about.
Absolutely. I could see it was obvious that it was meant for teachers, but I could see it function. And you mentioned this as that answer to students. Like it is that answer to your students asking, what is it now, 7 years ago? Why do we have to read this? Which of course is like it makes this book incredibly important because pretty sure that's just about every English student, undergrad and below's question at some point, right? And so really, really appreciated the value of this. One of the things you mentioned, I think even in passing here, is this, talking about your friend Aaron. Apologize, don't remember his last name off the top of my head, but how did we come to believe that all judgments are equal? And so that was the starting point for you, right? That he was like, the poetry's not good. And people are like, how dare you, as a literary critic, say that poetry is not good? And that journey was really fascinating to me. I'd never heard the name. I believe you use to kind of create that link, the name Marshall. I was not familiar with him. So if you could just draw that story out for our audience of how we came as a culture to believe that everyone's opinion is the same or of equal value, except maybe, you might have, if you're a better predictor of the market, you might have a better a better opinion than other people.
Yeah, it's a great question, and that actually, yeah, absolutely. That was my idea after exploring this. Was really what has blocked aesthetic judgment is consumer. The short answer is consumer culture and consumerism. And with consumer culture, you have the idea that everyone's opinions or choices or tastes are equal. And there's a kind of a really fascinating history to this, and it involves the extension of the principle of the equality of persons, in which we all hopefully agree to, and is a founding kind of principle of the United States, and obviously one that we just celebrated Juneteenth, that has evolved beyond the prejudices of the actual founders. But we believe that different people are equal, right?
Right.
That some people aren't born better or worse than other people. Now that's one thing, and that's a very important principle. But then to extend that, which we've seen in accelerating ways over the past century, to extend that to this idea that everyone's opinions or tastes are equal is something very different. And that happened, you really see the roots of it happening in an intellectual context in the late 19th century among a group of economists who later became known as neoclassicals. And Marshall is one of the thinkers that I talk about in the book in telling this story. But their basic idea was the marketplace. What we want to have organizing society is not from the top down in the sense of government or experts and so forth. We have this belief that the best way to organize a society is through the marketplace, the invisible, what Adam Smith called the invisible hand of the marketplace. And how that works is that you have to let everyone go out into the marketplace and make their different choices wherever they're at. And we're not going to try to create through government or other mechanisms ways to say that, hey, you should be buying this kind of lawnmower rather than this kind of lawnmower, or you should be using, riding your bike instead of a car or whatever else. We're just going to let the market decide. And that impulse, that idea, the consumer is always right kind of idea, the customer is always right, this idea that everyone's tastes and opinions are equal, that's very different from the idea of the equality of persons. And it kind of illegitimately piggybacked on that idea, on that democratic ethos, in order to spread this kind of consumerist ethos. Now, the problem with this is that if, so what happened was increasingly people who were who claimed a kind of expertise in any field became viewed with suspicion. Who are you, Dr. Fauci, just to use a contemporary example, you know what I mean? Who are you, Dr. Fauci, to tell me what is your opinion about what we should do about coronavirus better than my opinion? That's just an example of how this has worked out in different fields. The internet has greatly exacerbated this fundamentally faux democratic kind of movement towards equalizing everyone's opinions. But what happened was experts in all fields, now I'm concerned with experts in the arts, but experts in the arts began to feel that, hey, everyone's opinion is equal. Who am I to say that Shakespeare is better than Stephen King or more worth your time than Harry Potter or whatever else? And then that would be a really egalitarian move. But in reality, when professors and people educated in the arts abandon their responsibility to share their expert judgments with their students, it doesn't create an equal playing field that everyone's choice is equal. It in fact just authorizes, it makes the only judge of value now being the marketplace, right? And so instead of a kind of canon of literary works chosen by writers and professors and so forth, people who have been educated and trained in aesthetic appreciation and aesthetic history and so forth, instead of that, what you have is the Amazon bestseller list, right? That's what's most important. That's what's most valuable. Whatever sells the most. And there was a very famous conservative economist named Milton Friedman, who in 1960, in a book called Capitalism and Freedom, made this point. He said that, look, buying things is just like voting. So when people buy, when consumers choose to, let's say, buy millions and millions of copies of 50 Shades of Grey, they're voting for that. And that's the judgment, the democratic judgment of the people, that work is the most important work of that time. It's just their votes, right? And so once again, you see this conflation of democratic political principles with consumerist, free market kinds of principles. And so one thing I want to do is to resist this conflation and say, hey, if we give up on expertise in the arts, the only source of value left there is the marketplace. And I'm not, going to say, it's not like I want to go into people and say, you need to stop reading 50 Shades of Grey or whatever else because it's crap and you're idiots or whatever else. That's not what it's about at all. It's just saying, hey, you can enjoy that. That's cool. But if you're going to come and take an English class with me, I'm going to share with you some works that you may not have heard of. It may not be all over Twitter or Instagram, but my bargain with you is that if you spend some time and read these works with me, I bet that you'll come away with an appreciation, with some new ways of seeing the world, with some new ways of understanding the world, and you'll be happy at the end of the process that you did so. That's kind of the claim. And so when I say, as a professor who's trained in literature and in aesthetic judgment, these are some works that's I'm asking you to read. You have to read these books, right? It's not optional if you want to take the class. If you want to pass the class, you've got to read these books, and that's part of what's happening there. It's resisting the logic of the marketplace to provide people with a different and richer form of value.
One, thank you. A great summation of kind of the first part of the book. Just to make sure that I'm tracking with you on a couple points here. I'm curious. One of the ways that these two different versions of equality, kind of one, the equality of opinion piggybacking on equality of rights, it does feel, it kind of snuck in. This is what I see when you talk about elitist, that fear of being elitist is that people take their tastes very personal, right? And so they want to think that what they're doing is worthwhile, when they should probably just acknowledge that it's not worthwhile, right? Like they are reading something that is, and some people will do that. A great example of this, and this is something I wanted to touch on too, and you talk about this, how buying, one of your critiques is buying does not equal value. Buying is not voting. And it's very clear that a lot of consumers don't necessarily see, like they'll understand the value of, Moby Dick over 50 Shades of Grey. They know that this has greater aesthetic value, but they buy 50 Shades of Grey because what they really want is something, it's like we know what better food is, but we buy McDonald's anyways, right?
Absolutely, yes.
In part because of the dominance, and the bestseller list dominates, but the way you get on the bestseller list is ultimately, I would say, probably marketing. And that's what we see. Marketing becomes incredibly powerful for influencing aesthetic taste, which is primarily motivated by profit, right, rather than actual education. But I can't, going back to you talking about this critique where buying does not equal value, or reading does not even equal value. I'm in the process of getting ahead on several podcasts, so I'm reading about 2 or 3 philosophy books a week. And
That's
so
intense.
it's intense, and I am currently sitting about halfway through the first book, Swan's Way, of Marcel Proust. And for some reason, while reading these philosophy books, I don't find myself picking up Proust, even though I like it so much more. I find myself picking up, Vampire Hunter D, or like looking at TikTok, or like, this is not a question of value for me. This is a question of exhaustion, which you also mentioned in the book, that people are very busy, and so which is the problem with conflating in these cases voting with buying.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, and my own experience. And so this is a point that a philosopher named Theodor Adorno made in the 40s and the 1940s, which is that, and it's sort of a point that people have forgotten. He's been very influential, but this kind of point that he makes is, I think, been forgotten, which is that you can't detach the kind of cultural consumption people do from the kind of work they're doing, right? And so, and what you said is exactly right. A lot of people, and when I worked for a time doing manual labor as a painter, and when you get done with 8-9 hours of physical labor in the summer, working outside and painting office buildings and so forth, you're exhausted. You're not picking up Proust. You know what I mean? You're not picking up Shakespeare. Yeah, and so it's your one's capacity for that kind of cultural enrichment is circumscribed by the fact you have to work. You know what I'm saying? Which exactly doesn't mean, as you say, it's completely right. Doesn't, and that's one of the reasons why you can't imagine, as many people do, that most popular work is even the work that most people who buy that, even most of those people don't even think it's that great. You know what I mean? They might think it's just something that's fun or relaxing or whatever. So people themselves, individuals, are aware of these aesthetic value differences, which is part of why it's so perverse that academia has become allergic to making value judgments. And one thing I've found with my students who, and I've taught at different institutions, teaching students from a variety of social and economic backgrounds, students are hungry to have people, they know there's good stuff out there. They want to find it. They want to be exposed to it. They want to learn how to appreciate it. And if you're going to be a professor and just say, well, I'm not saying that any of these, I'm not showing you any works that are, aesthetically good or powerful. I'm just going to be teaching you something about history through books, or about, we're going to be looking at why these different writers were racist or homophobic or sexist or what in the past or whatever. That abdication of that job of exposing students to great literature is such a problem, and it's really the elites who've been seduced by this false egalitarianism, whereas there really is a hunger among people who are outside of that expert group
because they want to better themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they aspire to, and I did. I'm a first generation college student. We came from Ireland, working class family. My father dropped out of high school. You know what I'm saying? And so, but I grew up and I was like, I know there's some really cool stuff out there, richer ways of seeing the world, kinds of works and I was very eager for that, and I wanted to be exposed to that. And I'm very grateful that I had teachers and later professors who did that. Right now, I really think this is really, again, I think it's been accelerated by the rise of internet culture and social media culture. But right now, I found in academia this enormous resistance to the idea that professors should be telling students that certain works are better than other works. And when you tell people outside of academia that this is the case, they almost can't even believe it, right? They almost can't even believe it. And yet, when I published a version of this in the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is sort of the trade journal for academia, and I got this furious response from these professors at this elite, one of the wealthiest institutions in the world, in which they said, "You're being so elitist, right? We are not teaching our students that some literary works are better than others. We're teaching them, these political kind of doctrines and all this other kinds of stuff." And so there is this huge resistance, and it's accompanied by a more basic transformation in people's ideas of what higher education is for and what the humanities are for. And I think it's been going in a very bad direction. And this book was really an attempt to say, let's rethink this. Let's get back to basics. Let's get back to what we're trained in. I wasn't trained to tell you your political opinions were right or wrong. You know what I mean? Like, who am I to tell you? I will definitely say I am not the right person to tell you if your moral beliefs are right or wrong, or your political beliefs are right or wrong. I know about literature. That's what I was trained in. I spent a lot of time with literature. I can work with you with that. Not that other stuff. And yet we have a population of professors, especially concentrated in elite universities, who want to say, our job is to teach you what political opinions to have, right, or what moral views to have, right. And so we're going to be looking at different works, and we're going to be judging the characters and writers morally. And again, what I want to say is, well, who set you up to be a moral judge? How weird that you're accusing me of being an elitist for being a literature professor who's telling students what great literature is, whereas you're sitting there and you're telling your students, what's, making moral judgments left and right. So that's kind of where some of where what I've been pushing back against with this project.
And to make sure I'm following with you, in some ways, what you're referencing there is the what you referred to as like the dogma of the 80s, where you have the English departments as a profession often making judgments or claims that that are actually transdisciplinary that cannot sustain peer review in other disciplines.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's part. I mean, it's almost as if humanities professors have weirdly decided that we're going to abandon expertise in our actual subject matter and suddenly begin to pontificate in all kinds of subject matters about which we know nothing. So, to take an example, there's a lot of literary criticism and a lot of literature professors whose main thing they do in the classroom and in their work is to pronounce on economic matters, economic theory, economic history, et cetera, et cetera. And as I pointed out in a number of places, they don't actually know anything about economics. You know what I mean? They don't know the first thing about economics. I've done some interdisciplinary work myself, but it's difficult. And you try to do it responsibly. So I was interested in some developments in neuroscience. So I worked with some people at a neuroscience lab, published something in a neuroscience journal. You can do that work. It's just a lot harder to do than people might think. But you do have literature professors who will have classes and books talking about technology or biology or economics and all this sort of stuff. And again, it comes back to expertise. It's this weird thing. By giving up on expertise, by saying, I, the professor, am not an expert. I'm not going to be an elitist. I'm just like you. And yet then you've got students sitting in the classroom who have to listen to you or else they fail, trying to get a college degree and so forth. And you're going to be, pontificating on everything from economics to history to biology and so forth. That's a bizarre situation. I call it the bizarre world of the humanities. And it's just, and part of what I think is necessary is to go back to basics and to say, what we do, if you're a literature professor, what your job is to teach literature, to understand literature, to show your students examples of great literature, and to teach them how to appreciate it. That's kind of the job, and that's a big job, and that's a lot, and it's very difficult and demanding and challenging. There's doing other things, right? Either pretending you're not an expert at all, or pretending you're an expert in economics or politics or whatever else. Those, I think, are counterproductive and have been part of what has led the humanities to its current dire state, where you have students leaving the disciplines in droves.
Yeah, and that would, it's a commitment of years of learning, and then most of the time, years of paying off student debt afterwards. You're talking about a good portion of your life that you're dedicating to this. And if the point of it is just I want to hang out with the professor, present company excluded, of course. I'm enjoying hanging out with you, but it does, like, I'm not spending tens of thousands of dollars because to have a friendship with a professor, right?
Right.
Yeah, and to have him pontificate to me without any basis for his authority. That makes sense. Before we go too far, because I think this is, and you mentioned this, and I think you mentioned at the beginning, but how do we safeguard the equality of human dignity while advocating the importance of judgment? So this is something you address a little bit, but is there is there more that could be done in that way? Is there better terminology? More uh, is there more discussion on that front that you could give? Because that's obviously what everyone's really concerned about, right? That this idea that if I start saying that I'm better, like it comes down to that I'm better than you, right? And like
Yeah.
that's a really scary, it's like that, like idea. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah,
How to defend
absolutely.
that?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And what I would say is that the fear that people have that by saying I'm an expert, I'm saying that I'm better than my students or I'm better than you or whatever, that is it's a false and misguided fear. Because if you look at the situation, let's imagine myself as a first generation college student when I came to my first literature class in college. um, I wasn't imagining that the guy in front of the class, the woman in front of the class, would be someone who was just intrinsically better than me, and all I could do was bow down and listen to them. No, what I felt was this person knows more than I do right now. What I expect to get from this education is for me to be able, through being educated, to be in a position to be on the same level as this person, or at least in the same kind of ballpark of this person in terms of that knowledge, right? So it's real simple. There's no sense that I'm better than my students, or that I can't learn from my students, that my students just have to shut up and listen, or anything like that. It really is, and that I think is part of this ideological fear of elitism, which so often is hypocritical. For example, people will rail about the elitism of writers and literature professors while celebrating billionaires as populists, right? It's just completely insane. Um, but so yeah, there's no contradiction between a respect for the intrinsic equality of persons and a belief in expert judgment and in the existence of expertise. There's lots of things that I don't know how to do, and if music is one of them, right? And so if I want to learn more about music, which at various times I have in my life, and I've never successfully, I'm a terrible musician. I'll never be a good musician. But I go to someone who knows how to do it, and they can teach me how to do it. And the idea is, they can share their expertise with me, so I can get where they are. So I still tell my students, I can't tell you in a quick marketing blur why the works I've put on this syllabus are worth your while. But the bargain I'm making with you is that if you accept my authority and take this class and read these books, you will be in a position after we're reading these books to be able to either say, hey, I think this book is pretty great, or no, actually, I've heard your arguments, I've heard how you work this, and I think this book is crappy. So they can totally disagree with me. My class is about putting them on the same level, educating them so that they can make informed judgments themselves. So that's the kind of basic difference. And I get that people are afraid that that setting themselves up as experts involves a conflict with the respect for the dignity of the students and so forth. But I think it's a false conflict. However, I think there are real versions of that, which again is when someone says to you, I'm not an expert on anything, but you've still got to take this class, and you're still paying a lot of money to take this class, and I'm actually teaching you a bunch of stuff that you have no grounds to believe me as take me as an expert for. That I think is genuinely, and that's actually what you see happening. It's not like professors anywhere have abdicated their authority. It's not like colleges have stopped charging tens of thousands of dollars for these degrees, right? It's just that it's now operating, or tends to operate, under this faux egalitarianism, this false egalitarianism that often conceals the really creepy inequalities that go along with consumer culture and neoliberalism.
Uh, Pardon me if I take a little digression here. Are you familiar with the work of Hans-Georg Gadamer, Paul Ricoeur?
Yes.
So you talk a bit about sensus communis in the book, and Gadamer actually has an account of that going back to Vico as a and this is my background's in philosophical hermeneutics, so this this obviously popped in my head, but that sensus communis was redefined in the Enlightenment to be kind of this natural common sense, whereas before it was in fact uh, practical wisdom that had been passed down and formed through society, which was very similar to what your account of judgment. This idea of of knowledge that could only be passed through training in particulars. So I didn't know if you were familiar with that. I didn't know, but I found that particular argument, your argument here, to be very similar to Vico's critique of Descartes. And so, if
Yes.
anyone listening to this hasn't found this helpful, not helpful, convincing, I definitely think it's helpful. I think the argument with Descartes, like to me, this just all made sense, right? That Descartes is talking about using formal, explicit rules that things we can explicitly say in small parts, build it up, and then Vico says that's fine for people who have already achieved a certain level of maturity, right? To that we can build up whole arguments and whole ways of life. But when you talk to children, it's very obvious that you have to start with, no, this you need to, I know you don't understand now, but you need to be trained in the basics. And it's amazing to me how often just that form of argument where I take what someone is, their method, and I apply it to teaching kids, and it either shows that it works or it doesn't. Because that's it. Like you're like, well, college students actually know quite a bit. It's like, well, I want you to take this idea of judgment and I want you to apply it to kids, right? Like,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah. Yeah.
like,
Totally.
I mean, you know, Goodnight Moon is great, but if you're still reading it when you're 32, you're 40, and that's your main source of literary diet, I think we would be rightfully distrustful. I think that comes out in Kant, right? Like of you, like I think there's something else wrong here. So if you keep going to the absurd with it, you know, even to the point of like, I don't even think that's absurd. I think the pedagogy of younger children, it becomes even more dramatic, right? Like it's
Oh,
very
yeah. Yeah.
obvious. Like this, I'm not saying that I am worth more than my children. I homeschool my kids, but I'm like my authority and my better judgment is vastly clear. Like it's just like the difference between us in literary judgment, like it's laughable, right? So
Yes.
anyway, I
Yes.
found that super. I like, to me this all makes sense, but I thought that was an additional layer to what we're talking about. You give a list of 13 elements of expertise. If you had to add an element, because you said it's not an exhaustive list, if you had to add an element, what would you add?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I can't, if I could think of it, I probably would have added it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah,
But just I just wanted to, what you were saying earlier about Gadamer
sure.
and teaching kids, I thought was really right. Uh, and it, one way I approach a very similar, and Gadamer is also pushing back against Kant, who had this idea, which I think has been a really sort of corrosive and negative idea in terms of education, which is that the aesthetic is really about just what whatever you happen to look at and think is beautiful, and there's this sense that I expect others to agree with it because we all have this sensus communis or common sense of the beautiful and so forth. And what's so weird about that, and others have looked at this as well. What's so weird about that is that it doesn't take account of the role of education, as you say, right? Which is that one needs to be educated to appreciate many different forms of beauty. And in fact, what happened and what people have sort of analyzed is that you see that same move that we were just talking about, whereas people in the Kantian tradition would say that these things are just innately beautiful. And they would go like John Ruskin. There's a lot of people in the 19th century who would do that. That these things are innately beautiful, and then they would go into working class communities, and they would be like, and those communities would not think that those same things were innately beautiful that John Ruskin did, who was an upper class guy, and therefore he would sort of like throw up his hands eventually and be like, these idiots, you can't teach these people anything. You know what I'm talking about? So that's real elitism, right? That's real elitism,
Right.
that pretense that everyone should have it naturally, that you don't need to educate anyone. No, you do need to educate people. And what you say about teaching kids, that's how we all learn, which is through example. You know what I'm saying? It's not through a list of rules. It's like, yeah, I'm going to teach you how to read a bicycle. Here's the manual of 52 pages of how to read it. And here's the bike. Now you go ride the bicycle. There's no one in the world would ever learn how to ride a bike like that. You learn through example. And that's the same way that we do in literary education. Is I can't tell you in advance why Samuel Beckett or why Toni Morrison or why Gwendolyn Brooks is great. But after we spend some time working with this literary work, by example, we're able to show how and why you can get into this work, what perspectives it opens up, and so forth. So the same principle that we use in teaching our kids, that's those same dynamics. It's just how the human mind learns.
Yeah, and I think that becomes clear over time. Something you mentioned with John Ruskin, and that becomes important in your work as well, is allowing works to help create their own criteria. Because if you rely solely on formal definitions, you tend to privilege very specific genres, often older and more established, and in many ways elitist. You see with someone like John Ruskin not appreciating perhaps the working class opinion, right? But which is a slightly different thing. But can you talk a little bit about how going up to a work, close reading of new types of work can help you create new criteria for dealing with new types of work?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and that is something that I say in judging works. It's a principle I take from John Keats, the poet, who talked in a famous letter that the capacity a poet needs the most is what he called negative capability, the capacity to remain in doubt, the capacity basically to learn new things, right? To not feel confident that I have all the answers. And what you find paradoxically is that expertise, at least in literary study, is very often a learning to be comfortable with what you don't know and to be open to what you don't know, right? One of the marks when I was younger, the mark of my sort of lack of education was that I would know all the answers. You know what I'm talking about? Like, hey, I know everything. I knew more at age 14 than I know now at age 46, right? In my own mind, right? You know what I mean? In the sense that what I've learned through training and practice and so forth and experience is how much I don't know, right? And so I think that principle is key to expertise. It's a learning to be comfortable with what we don't know, because the human mind very naturally moves. We're uncomfortable with doubt and we want to shut it down. We want to reach for easy answers and easy explanations. But sitting with complex, challenging, unfamiliar new literary works, artistic works, really exercises that capacity to sit with something and be like, I don't know what's going on here. I don't know how I'm supposed to judge this. I don't know what the key features of this work are. And so what I try to cultivate in my practice as a teacher and as a writer about literature is that capacity to sit with that and figure out what criteria is right for this work. So to take an example, I wrote something a while back on rap music and on the genre of gangster rap in particular, which I think has some amazing examples of really powerful artworks. But the problem is that the way all the critics were looking at rap, they were dismissing the genres of rap that were really important to me, that I thought were really powerful, because they did not have the right political message, or they weren't formally inventive in the way that certain kinds of East Coast rap were, whereas Southern rap, which is the kind I was interested in, tended to do different things. And my thought was, look, I think you guys are just applying the wrong criteria to this work. To really find out what makes this interesting and fascinating, we have to look at some different kinds of criteria. So that would just be one example of how aesthetic judgment works and how we can say it's not the case that a single yardstick, whether it's complexity or formal inventiveness or or deep characterization, because think about science fiction, which I also love. Science fiction typically doesn't work through characterization; it works through world building, right? Or interesting ideas about the future, about technology. So I think part of the practice of aesthetic judgment is a capacity to sort of be in doubt and to be willing to put your own criteria up to the test of what this new work is showing you.
Yes, and you say that is the danger of these very formal, as you say, one yardstick approaches, is that they tend to eliminate whole swaths of important art, especially new and upcoming art, because I think you talk about Adorno famously not being able to handle jazz. If I remember
Yes.
like he just
Totally,
doesn't, he didn't have the categories to deal with it, which at the time was not as big a deal for him as like today. If you were to say that jazz is not a powerful art form, and that you could that just to dismiss it would not delegitimize jazz, it would delegitimize your critique, if that makes sense.
One hopes. Although there's no shortage of people who would say just because jazz is it's declined in popularity and in sales, and therefore there are people who want to say, again, it's that market egalitarianism, that whatever's popular rules. But yeah, absolutely. If I would agree, someone who's going to dismiss jazz is someone who just doesn't know jazz.
Right, and the same thing we see with classical music, right? I mean, we're talking about hundreds of years of tradition, and it's becoming less popular over time. When you see one of the things that distinguishes something like the humanities from the hard sciences, if I can use that term, is that you have a moving target. Do you think that's part of what that need for that negative capability or negative capacity? So, for example, I did a lot of work in philosophy of art about the artwork as an object, and people kept trying to define what art was. And as soon as there was any consensus about what art was, an artist would immediately create something that broke that definition, intentionally so, because they didn't like being confined. Would you say that is part of that need for negative capacity?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And I think that literature is moving and evolving. And one of the important, this brings up a really interesting question, which is that the kind of aesthetic judgment that happens in literature departments, English classes, is part of a broader ecosystem that includes writers, agents, publishers, editors, and so forth. And you need that negative capability, but you also need judgment and the capacity to say what's working, what's powerful, and have arguments about what's working, what's powerful, and what's not. And one reason why I think it's so important for literature departments and academia to continue to revive this function of aesthetic judgment is that aesthetic judgment, because it used to be back 50 years ago, you could say, well, okay, literature professors really don't have to do aesthetic judgment. Maybe they could just like go back and do philology, or they could do the history of literature, because the people who are going to do literary judgment are literary critics working for newspapers or magazines or whatever. But what's happened is that journalism has been eviscerated, right, by the rise of the internet. And a lot of reviewers who are out there have written about this. A guy named Christian Lorentzen wrote a piece for Harper's Magazine about this, which is that reviewers now are basically, they want clicks, they want likes. That's what their employers are really after. And they want you to be celebrating whatever the latest pop phenomenon is. They don't want you to take a resistant view to the market. They want you to be a cheerleader for the market and whatever the market throws up. So that crucial function of criticism, which used to be handled by journalism, it has now been sort of driven away from a lot of our public spaces and our public venues. And we need, and that's why the great thing about academia is it is sheltered to a degree from the marketplace. And so we can cultivate judgments and ways of thinking and speaking and teaching that aren't totally dependent on the bottom line or on clicks or whatever, right? And that's how new generations of writers learn from the past, create new traditions, break from those old traditions. You need to know those traditions before you can break from them in meaningful and powerful ways. And so it's all part of that ecosystem, a shifting mosaic. The new works that come about, it's not as if the literature professor is totally detached from those new works coming out. Very often, there are students have been creating those new works. You know what I'm saying? And so there's this, it's a really fascinating and interesting kind of relationship there.
Yeah. And your discussion about the evisceration of journalism, I think everyone senses that. I think there's what you've talked about, these kind of hidden ads, these masked ads that are really just cheerleading the market. And the other side that I would add to that is the need to, if it's not cheerleading, it's outrage. It's not careful. You can't just be like, hey, this work is mediocre, right? You can't, which is often the truth about most works of art, that they are just mediocre. It has to be, this is the worst thing that's ever happened, right? It has to be one or the other, because no one wants to read an article in this age of distraction that says, yeah, it was okay.
Totally, you're right. And outrage, moral outrage. Usually it's moral outrage.
Yes.
It's like, this work offends my morality, which is sort of like, what I want to know, is it good though? Right? Because it can offend my morality and still be good. It could be interesting, be fascinating. There's all kinds of works that I find, I don't agree with morally, right? But whose work I find completely fascinating and amazing and has enriched my life. But we've lost that capacity. Now, moral judgment, everyone does moral judgment. Aesthetic judgment is taboo, but everyone feels like they can be the moral judge, which I think is bizarre.
So that leads me, I want to be respectful of your time. In kind of my last question, you talked about, and I want to make sure that I read this correctly because of the way you just phrased that. As to what qualifies a literature professor to be a moral judge, I cannot say. My final speculation or hope for this book is that it will inspire someone to make the case for literature professors as moral experts. To show what moral expertise can teach us that we don't already know, to describe the skills and knowledge underlying this expertise, and to exemplify moral approaches to literary works, which I think there is something there. I think, even as you're talking about Polanyi's discussion of expert judgment, that it provides a defense for expert judgment itself of literature. I think the fact that in many ways literature communicates experience and particulars in a way that other things don't, he provides a defense there of a certain type of knowledge that is just judgment in itself, which and I think everyone does understand this there is a moral connection, right? And the easiest one, and a lot of people do talk about this, is empathy, right? But I think there's more about the ability to discern carefully. I understand that is beyond the scope of this book, but can you talk a little bit about how literature makes us better morally?
Yeah, and there's a terminology problem there that I address in a passage a little before that, but
yes.
I should have probably used a different term. I should have used moralistic instead of moral, because I think the kind of thing I'm reacting against is really moralistic judgments,
right?
Which are I am gonna tackle work because it doesn't fall into certain categories or stereotypes of what I consider to be morally good. It doesn't illustrate the dogma, moral dogma that I'm expressing. And this is what you find on social media culture, and many people have written about this. And I think it's a very bad thing with literature, and I think that it's corrosive of literature. But absolutely, one can get all kinds of. I believe there is a way to have literary education be moral education, and I think for me it starts with that negative capability. I think there's a moral quality to withholding my sense of projecting what I think onto everything in the world. I think one of the great tragedies of human life from the beginning of time has been how much of life's richness we exclude by our snap moral judgments. And so if we can think of artistic or literary education as a way of loosening our hold on what we know and being open to the complexities of human experience, the way it doesn't slot into easy categories, that I think is a kind of moral work. And it's opposed to what goes by under the aegis of moral education currently, which is I'm just going to express outrage about this work because it does X bad thing. Even, you know what I mean? It has some heterodox or unorthodox view that I'm going to react against. So there's a difference between moralistic and moral. And I probably, the one change I would make to this book, if I were to rewrite it now, would be to replace that word moral there with moralistic.
That makes sense. Yes. And if anyone's struggling with your discussion of negative capacity or capability, you also reference, and I can't remember the name of the professor that who you are referencing in this case, but the suspension of values for education. That when you are being educated, you are suspending your values in the hopes of receiving better values, right? And
yes.
And so that's a lot of what's happening in literature, is that you are learning to, I mean, and we see that in lots of different cases of expertise, but that might be another avenue for someone to understand what we're talking about, that we have to have, as human beings, the capacity to change our values over time if we're going to better ourselves. And that idea of, we do no one any favors by telling them they're okay when they're not okay, right? And so it's not elitist to say, I want to make myself better. And it's not elitist to follow after somebody. In fact, these are fundamental, important human pursuits, which is why I think this book is so important. Is there anything that you would want to leave our listeners with, kind of like a last call to action or a last observation?
I mean, the only observation I would make, and is for, if we reflect on what our motivation is, if we want to take an English class, or if we want to learn to be better readers, or we want to understand why certain works that are regarded as classics got that reputation, we are involved in exactly what you just said, in a pursuit in which we're trying to overcome our current values and acquire new values, or at least to expose ourselves to new values and then to decide whether those are values that comport with our vision for ourselves. And that's what humanistic education is all about.
Thank you. Oh, what a great way to sum up what we've been talking about today. Thank you again for coming on, Dr. Clune.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate the great questions.